My Uncle Carlos is a private investigator in Mexico, in a sort of middle-class area. Not exactly paradise by American standards, but far from the cartel nightmare that the country is sometimes painted as being. Don't get me wrong, it's like that in some spots for sure, but not here. Uncle Carlos used to be a cop, but a serious injury meant that he could no longer perform his duties. Not knowing what else to do, he started up his own investigation firm, figuring he possessed the necessary skills to do the job well. He imagined it would be a sort of lethal weapon lifestyle. When I was growing up, that's exactly how he described it. He'd tell me all these crazy stories about the cases he was working. They always involved covert missions, catching the bad guys, the occasional gunfight. They were all massively embellished, obviously, if not downright fantasies altogether. You see, the sad thing about PI work is that in reality, it's rather dull. Lots of mundane cases, mostly marital affairs. Hours of mind-numbing surveillance. Not really the buddy cop movie life that my uncle made it out to be when I was a kid. As I got older, he stopped making up these fantastic tales to keep me entertained, and started telling me about the reality of the job. Since his stories had made me want to follow in his footsteps, this was a major disappointment. One night, when I was even older, I was having a drink with my dad and Uncle Carlos. The topic of work came up, and I reminded my uncle about all of the stories he used to tell me as a kid. "It's a good thing the job isn't really like that," I said. "You wouldn't have survived your first day, Uncle." Yeah, he said. "Though I gotta tell you, kiddo, there was a reason I stopped making PI work sound so appealing." "What do you mean?" I asked. My uncle goes uncharacteristically quiet. Then my dad turns to him, and with a smirk on his face, says, "Hey Carlos, just tell him about the Solano case." "The Solano case?" My uncle gave my father that look. That one that means, "Yeah, I have your blessing to spill the beans?" "What the heck," my dad says. He's a big boy now. Turns out, my family had intentionally kept this story from me when I was a kid. They didn't want to frighten me. My parents had also asked my uncle to stop glamorizing his job, not wanting me to have ambitions of becoming a PI in the future. Anyway, here's the story my uncle told me. The Solano case happened all the way back in 2006. Uncle Carlos had been working as a freelance investigator for a good long while by that point, and had built up a reputation for himself. Word of mouth led a new client to his office, a woman called Maria Solano. Expecting this to be another cheating husband type gig, my uncle sat her down and asked her to tell him the nature of the case. What she said couldn't have been further from what he expected. Mrs. Solano's son had gotten involved with a gang of thugs in the area. It worried her and her husband, because their son wasn't anything like these guys. He was a smart kid, did well at school, and was hoping to go to university. They were far from a bad family. For whatever reason, he had started going to the gang's clubhouse every night. Soon, that became every day and night. It got to the point where the Solanos hadn't seen their son for 3 days straight. Fearing for their son's safety, Mrs. Solano's husband went to confront the gang on their own turf. Mrs. Solano sat for hours at home, waiting for her husband to return. He never did. The police did little to help her. They seemed unwilling to do much at all. Every time they made a half-assed effort to find the woman's husband and son, they'd come up with nothing. This confused and infuriated her. It was obvious who was behind both of their disappearances, the gang of thugs. Were the police unable to do their job, or just unwilling? She continued to hound the cops, demanding that they investigate. Some time passed, and Mrs. Solano received a phone call. It wasn't from the cops, though. On the other end of the line, a deep male voice told her to stay out of the gang's business. to stop searching for her missing family members. Said that if she valued her life, she'd cut her losses and move on. According to Mrs. Solano, the voice sounded a strange mixture of threatening and concerned. It also sounded vaguely familiar to her. She couldn't quite place who it was exactly, but she felt as if it was someone she had talked to before. Someone who worked in a local store, perhaps. She decided not to heed the caller's advice. Since the police refused to be of help, she started doing her own detective work. She went sniffing around the gang's headquarters. Unfortunately for her, this didn't go unnoticed. That very same afternoon, she received a letter while she was home alone. Inside it was a severed human ear. A note attached read, "We told you to stay away." Out of desperation, Mrs. Solano came to my uncle for help. The only things she could give him to help were pictures of her missing loved ones and directions to the gang's hideout. My uncle took the job. The first thing he did was call up some of his old buddies in the force and ask them what they had found out. The cops gave him nothing and warned him to drop the case for his own sake. Jesus, what the hell was going on? Not having anything else to go on, Uncle Carlos decided to drive to the gang's hideout at night and do some sleuthing of his own. He followed Solano's directions. Turns out, this place was remote. Real remote. A medium-sized shack out in the middle of nowhere, completely secluded. Getting close to it wouldn't be an option. It'd be too obvious. Instead, he parked up on a vantage point overlooking the shack and used a pair of binoculars to keep an eye on things. It was a particularly dark night, so as long as he kept his lights off, he was effectively invisible. Now usually, surveillance work is long and boring, but knowing what was at stake with this case, my uncle was fully engaged and focused. Over the course of several hours, he saw numerous gang members entering the shack. In spite of that, there was no sign of Mr. Solano or the son. As the night went on, things became extremely disturbing. In the early AM, about 15 or so gang members exited the shack, all of them naked and covered in white paint. They had built a large fire outside, which they were now circling. Then they stood there, contorting their body into strange, unnatural shapes. One of them led a dog out to the fire from the shack and proceeded to slit the poor creature's throat. As it died, they were all screaming, chanting, making inhuman sounds. All of this was so loud that my uncle could hear them clearly from his vantage point. This wasn't a gang. It was a cult. This was some fucking weird sacrifice. These guys were nut jobs. A bunch of fanatical freaks living out in the sticks, most likely off their heads on drugs. Why on earth were the cops ignoring these guys? Fearing his cover might get blown, and honestly really freaked out by what he had just witnessed, my uncle made a quick getaway. The more he looked into the group, the more he realized their cultish tendencies. It became obvious to my uncle that the police were either terrified of these guys, or were in their pockets. Potentially, a few of them could have even been members. He doesn't know. The reason he doesn't know is because he was forced to drop the case. You see, Mrs. Solano went missing. Just like before, the police did little to look for her. To this day, nobody has found a body or anything. No information about her or her family's disappearance exists online. Nothing. It's like they never existed. For whatever reason, the Solanos became ghosts. After the woman's sudden disappearance, Uncle Carlos himself started receiving threatening calls, telling him to stay out of the group's business. His cover had somehow been blown. They said that if he continued his investigation, then he'd end up like the others, and his wife and daughters would be sold into sex slavery. Since my uncle had nothing left to gain and everything to lose, he did what they wanted and dropped the case. They had already proven themselves to be people of their words after all. It's bothered him ever since, but there really wasn't much else he could do. His clients were most likely dead. The cops were either bribed, scared, or in on the whole thing. It was all totally messed up. As for the family's son, well, either he's dead too, or was brainwashed by the group and is still a member. Whatever the case, there was nothing Uncle Carlos could do about it. The risk of trying to expose the group was just too high. In the end, real life isn't like those detective shows and movies. The bad guys don't always get caught, and life just goes on. Makes me wonder how many other disappearances those bastards have been responsible for over the years. I don't know if you've heard of Missing 411. It's a series of books about people who have disappeared in the wilds of North America. Not typical missing person cases, though. Obviously, people go missing for all sorts of reasons. They get lost, maybe even attacked by an animal. Heck, a lot of the time, they want to go missing. No, these books deal with the unusual cases, the ones that nobody can seem to explain. The only reason I bring them up is because I'm a private investigator. I found out about these books after working on one particularly strange case, and now I'm certain that something strange is going on, and that people are trying to cover it up. I had been hired by a family to look into the disappearance of their son, a young man we'll call Chad for the sake of anonymity. Chad had gone missing in Yosemite National Park a year prior. The police got nowhere with the case, and the park rangers were being decidedly uncooperative. I'd worked on missing person cases before, and was confident that I could at minimum find some leads. We agreed on a price, and they told me everything they could about the moments leading up to their son's disappearance. On the day in question, Chad had gone out hiking with his friend. Now, these boys were outdoorsmen, went camping all the time, hiked all over America, were used to spending time in the great outdoors. What I'm trying to get at here is that these guys knew what they were doing. When the boys didn't come home that day, a search team was sent out to look for them. All that was found of them were their boots. 2 pairs of empty boots, standing ominously in a clearing, their owners nowhere to be found. No bodies, no blood, no footprints. Police dogs couldn't pick up any scent. Apparently, the animals got confused and started walking in circles. Now, these types of cases are usually pretty cut and dry. Most likely, they would have succumbed to some sort of injury, accidentally fell from a great height or something. But the whole area had been searched thoroughly. There was no trace of them. Bear excrement in the area had been collected and analysed. Nothing. Like Chad's parents had warned me, the park rangers were of little to no help at all when I tried to talk to them. They were evasive, hostile even. That was odd. I'd dealt with the Yosemite Rangers before, and they'd always been happy to assist me. There was a strange lack of evidence for a case that had been open for so long. It honestly left me stumped and unsure of how to approach things. That's when I came across the Missing 411 books. The author of these books has researched over 2,000 missing person cases that all share similar, mysterious characteristics. They all seem to happen in clusters around national parks. The few who are found alive tend to have memory loss, and those whose bodies are found died in indeterminable ways. The majority remain missing. When they are found, however, It tends to be in places that are seemingly impossible to get to by foot, or in places that had previously been explored thoroughly. In one such case, the body of a young boy was found laying perfectly out on a tree stump, many days after he had first disappeared, in an area which had been searched many, many times. Many of these people vanish in the presence of family and friends. One moment, they're right there. The next, they're gone. Much like with Chad and his friend, the police dogs in these cases never seem to be able to track a scent, and their handlers note how weird the creatures start acting. Experienced outdoors people vanishing off the face of the earth. Experienced hunters whose guns are found next to all their equipment. The weapons are never fired. The majority of them a similar age to the missing boys. Nobody knows exactly how many have vanished, but it's what's quickly becoming known as the nation's silent mass disaster. In the end, I couldn't give Chad's parents any answers. This was an impossible nut to crack. No matter how you look at it, things don't seem to stack up. Then, when you hear about all of the other similar cases in Missing 411, things start to make even less sense. All around this great country of ours, someone, or something, is taking our people. Some weird shit is going on in the woods, man, and I don't know how to explain it. I generally try to keep my cases private, but I'm willing to share just this one because it's so noteworthy. I was working a case for this woman a few years back. She was an absolutely gorgeous lady. Youthful, slender, dark eyes and hair. A real catch. Yet despite all of that, she thought that her husband was cheating on her behind her back. I asked her what aroused her suspicions. Had she found lipstick on one of his shirt collars? The smell of another woman's fragrance on his clothes? She said that she had no physical evidence. She just said that her husband had started acting a little off, coming home an hour or two later than usual, seeming a little colder and more distant. She figured he had taken a lover. Well, the wife had plans to stay at her parents' place that weekend, so what we decided to do was lay a trap to find out for sure. When her husband was at work, she let me into their house to place a few nanny cams and audio collecting devices around the joint. In my country, that's all above board and legal. Makes the job a lot easier than in some other places. Now let me tell you, their house was an absolute palace, and it turns out that the rich one in the relationship was her. Gorgeous and rich. I remember thinking that her husband must be an absolute moron if he was cheating on a broad like this. All the cameras were in place, and the woman leaves for her parents' place while I monitor the footage from my van outside. A couple of hours pass, and sure enough, in walks the woman's husband. This unremarkable sales type. A real suit. If a guy like this was cheating on a girl like that, he must be a real idiot. Another hour or two go by as I just watch this guy lazing around the house. Surveillance can be the worst. Sure enough though, someone eventually comes to the door. Busted, I think to myself. But it's not a woman. It's another man. Okay, now things were starting to make sense. But it's not what you think. This wasn't a lover's rendezvous. This was a business transaction. As I listen in to the conversation, it starts to become apparent what's going on. The guy at the door was a hitman. The suit wanted his wife dead, presumably so he could inherit her huge fortune. While his wife was away, this bozo was showing the would-be killer the layout of the house to make his job easier. That was their plan, to make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. The husband was going to conveniently be away from home on the night it happened. Had this woman not come to me when she did, she'd have had days, Literally days left to live. Needless to say, I contacted the police immediately. Of course, the two of them denied everything, but I had all the evidence needed to ensure they'd go down for conspiracy to commit murder. That's 2 life sentences right there, and 1 life saved. So there you have it. Those 2 arseholes are rotting in a cell somewhere. The woman got more for her money than she could have ever imagined, and when people ask what the most interesting case I ever worked was, I get to tell this story and feel like a bit of a hero. All in a day's work as a PI. Well, nah, not really. It's mostly just sitting around and eating biscuits. But still, this was a career highlight. Hopefully that woman chooses more wisely in the future when it comes to her romantic endeavours. If she's listening to this, I'm still available. Hey guys, Lazy here, and thank you very much for listening. So a little something different this time. I was trying to get that 1950s film noir feel, and hopefully I pulled it off, and hopefully it was to your liking. If it was, then let me know, and I'll consider making more of this type of video in the future, something a little mysterious, and not purely horror-focused. If you didn't like it, well, you know, smash that like button anyway, or I'm gonna smash you. Coming up next is going to be a little something different again, and also on top of that, I'm potentially going to do a live stream as well. Don't hold me to that, don't hold me to that. Anyway guys, until the next ones, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.